Hi, Mems, aka on Deck and Wings, and in this video I'll be taking a look at and giving my opinion on the Ionic paint range from Mig Ammo. So there are currently about 180 paints in this range. These are acrylic, made for miniature painting, and they come with a mixture of standard paints, metallics, and inks, which you can use washes and glazes. These bottles are a little bit more expensive than your standard acrylic paints. They're about £3.50 to £4 per bottle and about $5 to $6. They're a little bit cheaper in Europe because obviously Mig Ammo is a European company, so they're about €3 to €4 there. They have a different bottle design to your standard army paint. They have a flip lid as well, so you won't lose that lid if you take it off and misplace it. They also come with 20 mils of paints. Most standard army paints are about 70 mils, so you do get a little bit more paint in them. I'm going to test out a few of the paints and then give my opinion on them. Obviously, art is subjective, so it's down to personal preference, but I'm going to do my best to kind of describe how I find them. So first of all, I really do like the bottle design. It makes it easier to put the paint on the palette, and I don't feel like I'm having to put a load on accidentally. I can control that a little bit better with that flip lid. So I like the consistency of this paint. It isn't too thick and it flows really nicely. I find this paint compared to like your standard AK and Vallejo paints, it's not as thick, whereas I find like these types of paints to be thicker. I personally do really like AK paints, which are put down on the right. The reason these paints are usually thicker is they usually have like ingredient binders in them, so you can get like a better coverage on the model. I find the Ionic ones to be thinner and flow easier. And these Ionic paints, I feel like they're designed more for people who are a bit more painterly, so if you want to dilute these and get some glazes and washes, so you still have that bright pigmentation in it, even if you thin it down. The AK ones are still really good, but I find that it took me longer to kind of thin them out, and I still had the vibrancy with the Ionic paints even after thinning it out. I think it's important to point out that Ionic paints are supposed to be really vibrant and saturated. However, the downside with like having vibrancy is that you might have slightly less coverage. And I will get into putting the Ionic paints onto a model in a sec, but I just wanted to mention brands like AK and Vallejo and usually your standard miniature paints. They will sacrifice like the saturation and pigmentation of a colour in favour of coverage. So when they add like additional binders to make it flow better and to get better coverage, it sacrifices the colour of the paint. I think it's worth me talking about more painterly type of colours, which Scale 75 and like Chimera make. So these are thicker, more single pigment type of paints. On the left I have a Scale Colour paint, which I'm putting down the green, and then an Ionic one, which is similar. So these type of paints on the left, like the Scale Colours and Chimera, are heavy-bodied, like pure pigment paints, so they don't usually have like additives in them like AK and Army paint do. It means the paint is more vibrant, however you have to work into it quite a bit and it doesn't cover as well, but the vibrancy of it is really impactful. The Ionic paint will have some sort of binder in it to make it thinner and flow better. However, it won't be like to the same extent as additives in like Army Painter and other Army brands of paint, so that's why it doesn't cover as well but still has that vibrancy. So I'm going to use the ochre from Ionic now over a base coat of the dark ochre from Ionic. From my kind of conclusion, I think these are trying to be like high-end, more painterly paints, but without being as thick and harder to work with as the pure pigment ones like Chimera and the Scale Colours. As I said before, because these are more vibrant, you kind of sacrifice that coverage. However, it isn't a problem because you can work that to your advantage. Like I said, these paints are more for if you're actually into painting and not just wanting to get some quick army painting done. And so I'm just showing you here the kind of advantage to these slightly thinner vibrant paints. So I've put one layer of the yellow down, and then what I can do is put a second layer down when it's dried to push up the vibrancy in certain areas. So that kind of allows me to control the light and darkness of the model easier than just having one coat all of the same. And I'm really impressed with how much this yellow is vibrant and just stands out. It's one of the nicest yellows that I've worked with. The other thing I do really like is the names of the paints, so they are straightforward. And it's a little bit intuitive where you can see which are the darker colours, midtones, and lighter colours if you want to do some shading and highlighting more straightforward. But yeah, I was super impressed by this yellow. It really packs the punch. Next up, I wanted to try the ink. So we have the mahogany and maple here. So inks are like washes and glazes. Other companies have inks, but now they kind of have them more in favour of just straight up washes or like contrast paints. So I really like the intensity of this maple colour. It really stands out. And I do find they're a little bit easier to work with than some of the washes. And I'm just teasing it around here with my brush. They kind of remind me of the saturation of contrast paints, but obviously not as thick. And I personally tend to thin down contrast paints and make them into washes and glazes anyway. I skipped ahead here and I'm using that darker mahogany colour. As some of you might know, I paint them into Space Marines, so this is why I've gone for quite a few yellows and complementary colours. And I'm going to test these out on my Space Marines when I get the chance. So here's the model finished. It's all painted in Ionic paints. I think it looks great. However, one of the downsides is the inks will have a slight sheen to them if they pool in some of the recesses. So make sure that you thin them down in those areas if you need to. Moving on now to the metallics. I was really excited to try these out. And here we have the black metal. Yes, I love black metal. That's where On Dark and Wings comes from. It's a song. I was really impressed by the coverage of this metallic and how much it stands out. I'm really surprised by this because, like I said, the other paints were thinner for the vibrancy, but these still are quite vibrant and cover really nicely. And they're great just after one coat as well. Moving on to the gold. So I'm going to try this out. Again, this was a really vibrant colour on my palette. And this is a similar flow and consistency to the silver. I still think this as well covers really nicely just after one coat. And it packs a punch with how vibrant it is. And moving on to another metallic I just wanted to try out, which is the copper. This one's a bit more of like a darker copper colour, but it still covers nicely. I think the Dark Stars copper's a nicer colour, however the Ionic one is probably pretty good as like a shadow to the Dark Star one. I use a lot of Dark Star molten metal metallics, they specialise in them, but I do think these metallics by Ionic are really nice, especially the black metal and gold. So now I've kind of given a demonstration and talked about them, I want to talk about the pros and cons. So I love the vibrancy and saturation of these paints. The bottle design is really cool. I think it's a lot more straightforward to work with. There's a really good range of colours within these paints. I was really impressed by them. I like how you can thin them down and make glazes and still pack a punch with them. Metallics are great. I really like this idea of paint sets like AK do, and I think that's a great idea because it gives you an idea of what to shade and highlight with. So I wanted to mention some of the cons as well. So they're a bit more of a boutique brand, so the cost and availability of them. They're a little bit more thinner, so they aren't terribly thin, they're not transparent, but they're more, like I said, for painterly people or display painting. They aren't necessarily designed with like army painters and a quick paint job in mind. The ink had a bit of a sheen to it in the areas where it pooled, but that's true of like any inks and washes. And at the end of the day, do you really need more paints? There's always more paints coming out and influencers pushing them. I personally really like the Ionic paints, but I'm not going to completely replace the paints which I use at the moment. However, I do think these paints are great if you want to use them in tandem with other brands, so use these to push up and make more of an impact with your models. I definitely think I'm going to use these with my Lamentor Space Marines to make that yellow more vibrant. And if you're into painting your miniatures, I think it's worth getting a set or getting a couple paints and trying them out. I definitely think these are like a more accessible version of the true pigment colour type of paints like Chimera. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. As always, remember to enjoy your hobbies for yourself, and at the end of the day, they're just war dollies. All of my social links, etc., will be in the description below. I will catch you in the next one.